I am Maputi Murolo, a partner in Fasken's Johannesburg office and a member of Fasken's Global Mining Group. I'm joined by 4 panelists in the discussion on the transition from brown to green energy and its impact on the South African mining industry. We have Advocate Thabo Mokoena. He is the Director General of the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy in South Africa. Second, we have Sanjeev Mangru, who is the Energy Finance Principal at Nedbank. Next up, we have Dhesigen Naidoo. Dhesigen is currently a Senior Research Associate at the Institute for Security Studies Africa, and he's the Climate Adaptation Lead to the South African Presidential Climate Commission. Last, but certainly not least, we have Francois Joubert, and he is a partner in Fasken's Johannesburg office. My first question is to you, Advocate Mokoena. I'd like to understand, given South Africa's reliance on coal and other fossil fuels, which has then in turn created a carbon-intensive economy, one of the industries that's of course affected by this transition from brown to green energy is the mining industry. And the question we then have is whether brown energy contributors are still relevant in the South African mining industry, and whether there's an end date for our reliance on brown energy contributors.
We still have an opportunity that we can still derive from this brown, what you call brown energy or fields. Now, here we're looking at coal in the main, whether should the mining companies be worried that there is going to be a challenge. We are quite optimistic as the department that we have what we call a just energy transition, a document that we are busy consulting with relevant stakeholders on this document. Now, what is coming out, it is evident that as the country, we have an opportunity to derive a value from the brown energy, in a sense that we have an abundance of coal as the country. One point that I want to emphasize is that we're talking of other developed countries, and you can't have unequals competing, and you expect us to be at the same level when these developed countries, they have derived the value from the very same coal, which is now being condemned. Of course, we understand that we are part of the global market, and we have to also to comply with the instruments that we are party to, like the Paris Agreement and so forth. But for us as the country, because we're not going to decommission all the coal-powered power stations tomorrow, we still have a long way to go. And in terms of our policy position, we are very clear that it's going to be a systematic process. It must be a real just transition in a true meaning of the just transition without really coming up with abrupt decisions to move away from coal, which is our base load.
Francois, my next question is for you. The Department of Mineral Resources has, of course, indicated that brown energy is still relevant. I'm curious to understand what issues have been identified with brown energy, and why is the transition from brown to green energy relevant in South Africa or globally?
South Africa is not an isolated island. We are part of the international community. We've been part of the international community for a very long time. We're a front runner in many of the legislative frameworks around the world, specifically geared at the very objective of why we need to move from brown to green. And if you break it down a little bit and you look at the commitments from a South African government perspective in terms of multilateral environmental agreements, conventions. We are signatory to almost all, if not all, related to a cleaner and a safe environment. The Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biodiversity, Wetlands, Ramsar, and a myriad desertification. And what we're trying to do is to look at being a good world global citizen. We have committed through signatory and ratification to those conventions. And one of the cornerstones of each convention is to say, now that you have signed it and ratified it, go forth and implement it in your own jurisdiction. Make it work in your own country. And if one just look at that concept, our constitution as the end of all that governs basic human rights in South Africa has a provision that says our people has a right to an environment that is not detrimental to their health and well-being, and that right must be protected through reasonable legislative measures. For instance, the formation of the National Environmental Management, the National Water Act, and each and every other legislative instrument that governs an aspect of sustainable development. And I think this is where the difficulty comes in. What is good for a developed country that had 200 years of industrial development has used the very same resource that is now a swear word is a little bit unjust. And it is a little bit unfair to say you have to immediately change your ways. However, as a South African and being regulated by legislative frameworks, we all need to try and achieve the global goals.
There's certainly a strong message around a just transition. And to this point, I'm aware that South Africa recently published the framework for just transition. And to this point, I'm going to bring in Dhesigen and ask you, Dhesigen, that you just share with us what the purpose of the transition framework is and what its features are.
We've just seen the launch of the IPCC Working Group 2 report. It is very, very stark about the current impact of climate change on the world. It's explicit that more than 3.6 billion people in the world today, many in our own country, and certainly many, many more in the region that we live in, have already been very adversely affected by climate change. But in fact, the Secretary General of the UN talked about the report descriptor as an atlas of human suffering, and we cannot ignore this. The second issue is that common and differentiated responsibility that Francois talked about isn't only a global phenomenon. It is also a phenomenon in the neighborhood. And the comparison between South Africa and the neighboring countries around it, and the relative emissions, and the relative impact of climate change. In fact, it's fair to say that the loss and damage discussions are going to be very, very difficult ones. And the third factor that I have to put on the table is that a lot depends on how fast the world as a whole moves, because that would have implications for where South Africa and countries like South Africa see themselves. I mean, if you look at the really ambitious targets of very high emitters in the developing world, like China, like India, they actually are giving us a strong indication of where some of those players are going, and we should not be too far behind. The issue of the just transition is a very important one. It is a recognition that the South African economy, by and large, operates on the mineral energy nexus. You know, we can philosophize about it if we want to, but this is the grim reality. You know, it is the core of our economy, it is the core of our financial system, It is a very important mechanism for livelihood for a fair number of people. It's declining now because of very high unemployment rates in South Africa. It's also declining because of the fairly inadequate energy security rates in South Africa currently. So the key point I want to make is that we need to move towards the diversification of energy very, very rapidly. The ratio between green energy and brown energy needs to move very rapidly in favor of green energy.